Cheers and salutations. Welcome one and all to Americans Learn. My name is Kit, and welcome as we return back to the toe-to-toe slug match. That is the Third Reich versus the Soviet Union, the Eastern Front, animated none other by the great YouTube channel that we've been recently been informed of its existence called Eastory, which I really like. So here's what we're going to be checking out. In the last episodes, we were checking out the Eastern Front animated from 1941, 1942, 1943 to 1944, and now finally, we return back to the fight. That is 1943 to 1944. So all you wonderful, beautiful people, let's go ahead and continue on with this adventure and see what exactly happens. Who will win in this huge fight? So as always, in the link in the description box below is a link to the original content creator. So please, everyone, do the right thing. Do the right thing. Support the original content creator. Eastery has posted a lot of great content, so just be awesome as you should be. And let's get started with this video in a 3, a 2, a 1.
In the last months of 1942, the German forces were encircled at Stalingrad. At first, the Germans hoped to reverse the situation by relieving the pocket and maintaining it by air supply. However, as 1943 began, the Germans were forced to abandon their plans to relieve the city and were pushed back from its approaches. Despite that, they ordered their troops in Stalingrad to hold out as long as possible in order to tie up Soviet units and buy time. The advance of the Red Army created the possibility of the German troops in the Caucasus to be cut off. They ordered a full withdrawal from the region while their forces in the north kept the path of retreat open. The main effort of the Red Army was, however, directed against the Hungarian and Italian units on the northern flank. Their lightly equipped forces were unable to hold the line and were forced into a harsh winter retreat. Most of them lost their combat capabilities or were destroyed, leaving a large gap in the Axis lines. The German units in the north
Well, they weren't ready. I think as we covered before in the past, the initial invasion for the Axis forces was essentially a huge push forward. I mean, they had everything going for them, but time was of the essence. And let's face it, a majority of their equipment required the precious liquid gold called oil, and that's something that the Third Reich and its Axis associates just didn't have. And so, as they kept on pushing forward, and as the years progressed from 1941 all the way up right now to 1943, it is abundantly clear that the tides have turned against Germany and its forces, and the Soviets now are beginning the great push against Hitler and his thugs.
had also to retreat, but they were able to keep their battle worthiness intact. At the same time, the Germans managed to pull back part of their forces from the Caucasus. The remaining troops formed a breachhead on the coast to retain the opportunity for a summer push towards the oil fields. During January, both sides had their full attention set on the southern sector. The lack of the German reserves allowed the Red Army to achieve two small but significant victories. They re-established a land connection to Leningrad, and in the central part of the front they captured the railway junction of Velikie Luki. For the Axis, the situation in the south continued to deteriorate. The German troops in Stalingrad surrendered, freeing up significant numbers of Soviet units. The Red Army forces moving west into the Ukraine were not very formidable, but the large gap in the Axis line left them little opposition. The Soviet command decided to exploit this opportunity and attempted to cut off almost all of the army group south. In response, the Germans used the forces retreating from the Caucasus to extend their front eastwards and pulled their main force west.
Nope.
The Red Army moved further west to bypass their line and encircle them, but this overextended their forces. The Germans counterattacked from two sides and disorganized their forward detachments. Having caught the Soviet southern flank off balance, the Germans now wanted to push in both from north and south at the same time, destroying the whole Soviet force. They began to muster their units for the northern attack. In the south, their troops continued onwards, retaking Kharkov. But in the north, they failed to concentrate a force sufficient for the attack, though they were able to stop the Red Army's advance. By this time, both the Soviets and the Germans had exhausted their forces and went on defensive. As the fighting in the south had drawn all German reinforcements.
First of all, again, everyone, please be sure to subscribe to Eastery. The way the narration and storytelling, as well as the attention to detail for all the military units that are there, Come on, that deserves a subscribe. Make it happen.
Reinforcements, the Red Army prepared to launch a major offensive in the north and center. The Germans realized the danger and responded by abandoning their most vulnerable positions before the Soviets had finished deployment, and the attacks that took place failed to achieve their goals. Being confronted with a much stronger German line, the Red Army abandoned its offensive plans and the Eastern Front became quiet. With the end of the winter campaign, the Axis had lost the capabilities necessary to knock the Soviet Union out of the war by capturing the areas vital for its war effort. Now they planned to win through attrition by holding on to the occupied areas and inflicting vast casualties to the attacking Red Army.
None of that's going to matter. I think we've talked about it before in the past. In this modern day and age, you need oil. It's one thing to have the other resources there, but attrition isn't going to work out, especially with the Soviets. They're going to want all their territory back. Not to mention, Germany has a problem with Great Britain, the French resistance, other resistance members within occupied Europe. Also take into account that the United States has also entered the war as well. None of this can be held onto, and not to mention Italy has been having a devastating campaign all over North Africa, in Greece. It's only a matter of time before all of the Axis-occupied territories start falling out of Hitler's grasp. So, already looking at this entire map, give it time. The Axis will crumble.
In this way, they could drain the areas remaining under the Soviet control dry of resources and create a stalemate. The Red Army, on the other hand, set out to take back the economically vital western lands of the Soviet Union, which would give it a strategic advantage. However, this time they would play it safe. Their previous offensives had been threatened by the German armored counterattacks, and this time they decided to receive them on prepared defenses. At the same time, with building up the fortifications, the Red Army formed a massive offensive force. As part of their defense strategy, the Germans planned a number of limited offensives to encircle Soviet forces and shorten their defensive line. The most promising of these was the encirclement of the Soviet units in the Kursk salient. It took 3 months for the German build-up,
also known as the biggest tank battle in World War II,
to match the gradually improved Soviet defenses, and in the beginning of July they launched their attack. The Germans made some headway, but were ultimately stopped dead in the depth of the Soviet defenses. Having for the time tied up the strongest German armored units, the Red Army now released its forces for the offensive. The attacks were to be carried out in consecutive stages along several sectors of the front. First, the Red Army struck into the rear of the German troops north of Kursk. Being unable to contain the attack and wishing to avoid the danger of encirclement, the Germans began the process of evacuating the salient. At the same time, the Red Army launched an attack in the south. The Germans redeployed their forces and contained it. By this time, the Soviet units south of Kursk had finished reorganization and pushed towards Kharkov. The Germans redeployed their forces to the sector but failed to hold the city, though succeeded in temporarily containing the Soviet advance. The situation in the north was more under the German control. The Red Army failed to break through the German defenses near Smolensk. At the same time, the Germans had finished their withdrawal to the new line, strengthening their positions further. By this time, the Germans had been able to maintain the balance and check the Red Army's attacks. However, the renewal of the Soviet offensive near the sea broke the German line and forced them into a large-scale retreat. Even more, the concurrent offensive against the lightly fortified German positions on the former western edge of the Kursk salient resulted in a breakthrough the Germans weren't able to contain. They now realized that they lacked the troops necessary to contain the Soviets in their present line and ordered a retreat to a much better defendable Panther-Wotan position that was centered around the Dnieper River and its tributaries. At the same time, the Soviet breakthrough near Smolensk hastened the retreat of Army Group Center. With the German forces taking a stronger defensive position, the Red Army had to concentrate its main effort on a shorter section of the front. They decided to make regaining western Ukraine the main priority. First, however, we'll take a look at the central part of the front, where the Red Army had outrun the Germans to the Dnieper and had established a breachhead on the junctions of the Army Group Center and South. They planned to trap the whole Army Group Center by combined strikes from the breachhead and from a breakthrough in the north, while the other forces would pin the Germans in place. In October, while part of the Red Army was still recovering from the pursuit, battles were fought in order to secure the breachhead. Meanwhile, the other forces began creating a breach in the northern part of the front. With their
I think we're all noticing a huge trend here, and that is the Soviets are doing Operation Push Forward, and the Germans are doing the tactic of run, 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 run as far away as you can, because the Soviets want their revenge.
Their main focus being in the south, the Red Army had established several breachheads over the Dnieper in Ukraine. After they had got their heavy equipment over
Well, even if it's in 1943, there's still some stuff happening in Ukraine, I guess. Oh boy.
the river, they attempted local breakouts, first of which took place in the south. The Germans were able to contain it. Then the Soviets broke through the German land front, severing their connection with the Crimea. They proceeded with another breakout attempt near Kiev, but the Germans redeployed their troops and pushed it back towards the river. Having not fully succeeded in the breakouts, the Red Army adopted a more systematic approach, slowly but surely expanding its breachheads and massing troops for a larger breakout. In the center, the Red Army was now better prepared, which allowed it to increase the pressure. It resulted in a breakthrough in the north. The Germans held on to the flanks in the hopes of conducting a counterattack and cutting the Soviet forces off. Then the Soviets launched their main attack from the southern breachhead. It broke through the lines and gained limited success, though it failed to achieve its objective. The Germans were able to prevent a deeper breakthrough by abandoning territory and pulling back their front line. As 1943 ended, the Red Army was ready for the winter offensive, which would encompass the whole Soviet-German front. In Ukraine, the Germans had concentrated their defenses in the Great Bend of the Dnieper. This allowed the Red Army to catch them off balance by mounting a breakout from the Kiev breachhead. The Germans managed to contain their advance only with great difficulties. They wanted to keep their last position near the Dnieper River as a staging area for a possible counterattack and did not evacuate it despite the evident threat. The Red Army exploited this by cutting the salient off with a two-pronged attack. The Germans launched a rescue attempt and were able to retrieve part of the encircled forces, but without their heavy equipment. With the German attention directed towards the pocket, the Soviet forces launched attacks on the flanks, threatening to sever the connection between the army groups south and center. Meanwhile, Soviet troops were continuing with their attempt to encircle Army Group Center itself. In the north, the Germans realized they lacked the force to cut off the Red Army's breakthrough and abandoned the exposed salients. The Red Army now attempted to encircle the town of Vitebsk, but it was not met with success. Most of the Red Army's offensive assets were deployed in the south, and as a result, the goals of the Soviet forces in the center proved to be beyond the means to achieve them. The offensives took limited territory at the price of large casualties and were eventually abandoned. During the summer, the Soviet pressure on the Army Group North had not been as strong as against the other army groups, and the Germans had dispatched a lot of its strength to other fronts. Despite its greatly reduced strength, the army group had not withdrawn to the shorter line and still held its forward positions. The Red Army attempted to encircle part of the German forces during the winter offensive. The Germans evaded the encirclement and then attempted to resist on the new positions, but they lacked the strength to do so, and it was decided to withdraw to the Panther Line. Both armies settled on the new line, and during the remaining part of the winter, the Red Army undertook only some limited attacks in order to probe the German defenses. The Red Army was planning to achieve its main success in the south. During the preceding half-year, the Soviet forces were slowly but steadily consolidating their positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, and by the beginning of March, this process was complete. The German Army Group South was by then pushed into the open plains and did not retreat behind any other natural obstacle, leaving it vulnerable. The Soviets wanted to pin the whole army group to the Carpathian Mountains or the Black Sea and destroy it. The Axis were unable to resist the Soviet tank armies.
So already, in the previous videos that we've seen here on this channel, especially in early 1941, everything was working in Germany's favor. It's allies as well, as they were pushing forward into Soviet territory. And this was a concern that a lot of people had, during the early stages of this invasion, that should the Soviet Union fall, not only would the Germans have access to oil fields, but they would be able to update and keep on producing more of their machinery and continue to threaten the rest of the world, especially in the other theaters, such as in North Africa, possibly to continue the bombardment, aerial bombardment, potential invasion of Britain, because the only way you're going to sustain any kind of mechanized warfare is through a very secure supply of oil. But the thing is, time wasn't working for the German side. So, with their inevitable collapse and the fact that their timetables didn't add up properly, never invade Russia. The only people who've done that successfully was Genghis Khan and his fantastic friends. And if you're not with Genghis Khan and his fantastic friends, then you're going to lose terribly. Napoleon Bonaparte tried and failed. The Germans, I think, tried in World War I and failed. You just don't do it. So the Soviets are pushing forward and gaining momentum, which will eventually lead to the Soviets knocking on Berlin's front door.
And the whole front fell back. Near the Black Sea, they began pulling back their forces, but in the west, the Red Army encircled several German corps. The Soviets made the mistake by expecting the Germans to retreat southwards, which allowed them to extract most of the trapped force back to their front lines.
That was an incredible escape. Hold on.
The Soviets made the mistake by expecting the Germans to retreat southwards, which allowed them to extract most of the trapped force back to their front lines. Then the Red Army captured the...
That was an incredible escape. That was an incredible escape.
Crimea as the last operation of the winter campaign. The Soviet Union had taken back its most economically valuable lands and gained the resources it needed to defeat Germany completely. However, with the front being still more close to Moscow than Berlin, the question was, how long shall it take? The Germans, meanwhile, had other problems to deal with. The Western Allies had landed in Italy and were preparing to do the same in France. The race to Berlin was on.
Now, who will get to Berlin first? The Allies or the Soviets? Okay, well, listen, hey, spoiler alert. If you haven't been paying attention in history class, don't unsubscribe to Americans Learn. But surprise, surprise, the people who get to Berlin are none other than the Soviet Union. I know, spoiler alert, hashtag unsubscribe, but that's what happens. But nonetheless, talk about great attention to detail. Talk about a awesome battle map showing not only the epic escape of those German forces from the Soviets. I was not expecting that, and I never heard of that. So let me ask you, our viewing audience, if that is if there's a video that talks about that escape, or if there's anybody who's covered that, please type in the comment section below. If there's books that we should check out, we do want to have engagement with our audience, so please let us know. At your earliest convenience. So, type in the comment section below if you know anything. We'll be sure to check it out here on Americans Learn. Otherwise, be safe, take good care of yourselves, and as always, keep your heads on a swivel and keep on winning.